Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Duane Lauricella.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Duane Mancini, and he is the host of the Project Medtech Podcast and another podcast. Actually, I don't know what the name of it is. You're just launching it now. What's the name of it?
Yeah, it's Medtech Money. I don't host that one. Giovanni Lauricella does, but it's part of the Project Medtech family.
And Giovanni's a friend of the podcast as well. He's probably going to be coming on pretty soon here. So, Duane, you were working in the medtech field, and then you decided to go a little bit independent and launch your own thing. Have started, thanks to the podcast, your own network, and now you're doing consulting and everything like this. Do you want to describe a little bit your journey and how you've gotten into this?
Yeah. I have a master's in medicinal chemistry, which we joked about on my podcast. But anyways, so I joined NAMSA back in 2015 and joined right at a peak of the FDA starting to require chemical characterization testing or asking for it. And then there was this thought of using a risk-based approach to address biocompatibility. You could reduce the amount of animal testing needed, that kind of thing. So I'd gotten into the industry then with NAMSA, and NAMSA was such a great company to work for because they allowed me to learn so many different areas of product development. So regulatory, reimbursement, clinical strategy. They let me play in all those areas. And then I took a position working with a lot of their startup companies to build these end-to-end programs for them. I left NAMSA in 2020, just like right at the peak of the pandemic almost, right? Or the beginning of it, I guess, what we thought was the peak. But it was like April of 2020, and went over to Covance, which is now LabCorp, and was doing business development for them and their medical device group. But in between there, I had launched Project Medtech as a podcast. And it is funny that Project Medtech has materialized into an actual company. But when I first had launched that, it was just a way for me to own the content that I was going to put out for the medical device space. And so I didn't want to have to be beholden to LabCorp, who may or may not have probably wanted the content to have relevance to whatever they were selling. I wanted to do it for startup companies. So that's how I launched it. And then slowly reached out to some of the co-founders of Project Medtech now to help materialize this bigger network, this bigger company. And so currently we have a media and network side of the company. We have a consulting advisory side of the company. So the two podcasts you referenced, one is Project Medtech. The other is Medtech Money. So Project Medtech kind of covers, and you've been a guest on the podcast, anything related to that medtech space that I feel startups would want to hear about. Medtech Money was something we made separate as we found the number one issue entrepreneurs deal with is who to raise capital from, how to raise capital, the different options, what's a convertible note, what do VCs look for, all these different things. We just spun out a whole separate podcast for that. And then we host in-person and virtual events. So we have our startup symposiums, which are essentially boot camps for startup companies. We host them. We'll have 4 this year. So we have one in Akron coming up in March. We have one in Columbus in June. And then we're looking at 2 other locations later in the year. And they're pretty much taking the larger events you're used to seeing in medtech and shrinking that down. So instead of 500 attendees, we're shooting for no more than 100. Same type of content with a little more educational flavor to it, covering IP, regulatory, reimbursement, clinical, raising capital, user needs, how to get to an MVP, all these different kinds of things, but then allowing ample time for networking just in a smaller group. So it's actually manageable for startups. Our virtual happy hours are great. Those are online. Those are just like a group of people getting together to discuss specific topics where we invite a guest to be the leader and talk about specific hot topics in the medtech space, but allow guests to interact. And then our advising and consulting practice is focused on we're the general contractors for your medical device company. We're helping, you could think of it as fractionalized CFO services, fractionalized CEO services, or entrepreneurs in residence. We'll help with product development at a high level, project management, fundraising strategy. Who are you going to raise money from? How are you going to do it? Pitch deck support, just general consulting. So that's really where we're focused, is on that leadership side of the consulting advisory piece. We're not going to write a 510K. We're not going to do your biocompatibility. We're not going to do any of those, not a quality management system. We have preferred partners for all that. We're really focused on, supporting the leadership of these early stage startup companies and really just figuring out where to begin and how do you get there. So more hands-on advisors.
That's amazing. That's really cool. And this was all basically built up in the last 2 years or what?
Yeah, I approached my first co-founder in September of 2020. He joined in November of 2020 and said, "Hey, this is my idea. Maybe we get there in 5 years." And then I quit my job in December of 2021, and then started this full time in 2022. So it hasn't been long, but it's been incredibly exciting. And I think it was 5 to 10 years off. And then it was 2 to 3 years off. And then it was like 6 months off. And then it was 3 months off. And there was more of a need than we had thought. And things materialized as we brought in other co-founders and partners and things like that. But I never would have thought it would have been this fast when I first founded the company.
Yeah, no, that's really amazing. That's inspiring for me too, because I started this a long time ago, but I've also been busy doing other stuff and definitely didn't have the experience or network or anything like this. So in building that up, but yeah, that's really impressive. So let's talk about the podcast, both podcasts. What are the topics and themes? What do you usually cover on both of those?
Yeah, on mine, we're covering, it's a hodgepodge of stuff. We'll cover regulatory for software as a medical device. I had you on to cover the neurospace. What's new in the neurospace? What should people be looking out for? We've had episodes on, hey, maybe you're a startup, you've launched in the US. How do you access China? It's something that a lot of medical device startups are going to have to figure out. So how do you get into the Chinese market? What are the different nuances there? How do you so it's funny because in the US and even in Europe, how do you get your product covered in the US, right? In the UK, you could do one episode on how to get your device paid for through reimbursement in the UK and most European countries. In the US, we could probably have 50 episodes and you still won't know. It's so complicated, right? So anyways, we'll cover things like that. So that's what we're focused on, Project Medtech, right? It's the catch-all of the startup space in medtech. And then that Medtech Money one is really focused on demystifying raising and investing capital in medtech. That is going to be great entrepreneurial stories of how they raised money. It will be, and everything from seed through going public. And then from the investor side, it's what investors look for in a seed round all the way through a Series C in the US, outside the US, including Israel, Europe, Australia, wherever. That one is really focused on that capital raising side of things.
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic for me. I think definitely the entrepreneurs I interact with find that very interesting. They're always starved for cash, so they're very motivated by that. So let's talk about how I like to give value to my audience, especially maybe people interested in entrepreneurship, starting companies. You've been doing the consulting kind of this. I really like this idea, the fractionalized CFO, CEO, everything like this. What are some kind of problems or challenges that a lot of entrepreneurs face and that's maybe easily fixable or something that maybe they're just doing wrong and they could change pretty easily?
Yeah, I think a big one for me is truly identifying your market, like actually defining the problem too. I think that's a big issue. And it's something, I didn't really realize was an issue because you get a lot of founders who will be in the healthcare system themselves. And then they say, oh, this is something I always struggled with. And here's my solution to that. And then when they go to validate that, they face like a biasy that they don't even realize, like it's an unconscious bias of they're asking questions that are going to validate their problem rather than actually going out and doing some in-depth research on, hey, is this really a problem elsewhere? So I think something that in episode 3 or 4 of my podcast, it's so long ago, Lance Black he was at the Texas Medical Center, TMCX, and he's moved on to a startup. And he had said his biggest advice is be a historian of the problem. So once you've identified this problem, you have to be a historian of how has this problem been attempted to be solved in the past, because sometimes it's as easy as, hey, that last problem was just too early and maybe it's a good solution now, or maybe your solution has actually already been tried in the past and it failed because of this. So I think that was something that was, oh, that's a really good nugget that I need to hold on to give back to the companies I consult with. So I think, right, identifying the problem and then actually understanding how it was tried to be solved in the past. I think another one, just following that lineage, is not making a decision on how you are going to solve that problem based on regulatory, right? It's mind-boggling to me that companies are like, yep, as long as that problem's a 510K, that's where we want to stay, because we don't want to have clinical data to achieve market or to achieve, FDA approval. And that's just a weird one for me, because you could really alter what you can claim, and that can really push you into some different, that changes what market you can go after. And I think that's dangerous. And that is a really early on error that companies make, because you have an idea. Okay. You have the problem, you have the solution. Okay, great. The next thing is, let's figure out what we need to do to get this approved. And they go to a regulatory consultant. The regulatory says, well, if you do this, then you can just be a 510K and you'll get to market quicker. And it's, okay, great, we'll do that. And they don't realize that now that changes the claims they want to make later on. So I think that's a really big piece that you need to understand at an early stage, how regulatory affects reimbursement, and the effects, the overlap there of those two things is really important. So let me stop there if you have comments or questions, but that's a big one.
Yeah. So I guess for this last one, the way I'm understanding it is 510K is a lower activation energy. And so basically there's a smaller moat, and therefore more people can get into it, and you're maybe a little bit more limited by the claims you can do, because you have to follow the guidelines of other people, or a little bit of history, follow the history. Is that more or less correct?
Yeah, definitely. It's just a lower barrier to entry in terms of the data you need to show the FDA.
Which means it's a lower barrier of entry for everybody else as well.
Yeah. Look, you can only be they're considered Me Too products, right? You're trying to prove substantial equivalence to whatever else in the market so that you can get your device approved. So your device can only be so different at that point. There's great products. There's great 510K devices that have changed the marketplace, but the rate at which a 510K changes healthcare is way lower than the way a de novo or a PMA will. So I think just keep that in mind, is like, your innovation can only be so different. So I think, again, and that's a broad assumption, but I don't know. I just watched, sometimes when I hear people talk like that, it makes you sound like you're looking at the FDA. It's almost like you're looking at regulations as a cost burden, and that's really dangerous. And so that kind of mindset, that kind of culture can be, I just posted about it today. We just watched a Netflix documentary last night about Boeing and their issues they had with their 737 Maxes. And it made me think, watching that, what's the takeaways that relate into the medtech space? And it was, the couple that I had one was culture, right? It was like, if the culture of your company is not great, you're going to fail. And the second thing was safety. And it wasn't that, like, regulations should not dictate your safety plan. Like, you should have a safety plan that you feel that you are so confident that when this goes into humans, it's safe. And it's almost like you're just looking at regulations if you're looking at regulations as a checkbox, that's probably your first issue right there. And that's something I see in the med tech space sometimes. Like, that's another place where companies fail. And that mindset can start right at the beginning when you're looking at regulatory and you're going, what's my easiest path to market? Is that the best path to market though? I don't know. So anyways, that's a long-winded answer for what you asked.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine. Maybe, looking at it, the regulations, like an obstacle put there to fumble you up versus, hey, these guys are actually trying to help us, and doing this well will help us in the future as well. So Duane, I want to talk about your work before all of Project Medtech and this chemical analysis. What was it? What was your degree again? Apothecary?
Medicinal chemistry. Yeah. Go ahead.
So as I was saying before we started recording, this is what I'm studying as well, doing my PhD, and is basically accelerated aging and biocompatibility and everything like this. So what can you tell us about this? as you're taking a drink.
Yeah. So I had, when I had first started, NAMSA was already practicing this risk-based approach. So pretty much the fundamental was, when you do biocompatibility testing, if you have an implant, you would extract it in saline or sesame oil or something along those lines, a polar, a non-polar. Then you would take that extract and you do a number of different tests in animals to see if there was any kind of toxicity issues, right? Sensitization, irritation, cytotoxicity, acute systemic, pyrogenicity. There was systemic toxicity. There was carcinogenicity. There's reproductive toxicity. There's all these different things you have to address. And the thought, what if we did those extracts and then analyzed it using analytical instrumentations, right? UPLC-MS, right? So mass spec, gas chromatography, ICP to look for different metals. So if we could actually get a profile of what's being extracted out of this device, can we make conclusions as a toxicologist to say, hey, you know what? You don't have to address genotoxicity in an animal because we know that none of these compounds being extracted are genotoxic. And same with systemic toxicity. A lot of those systemic toxicity issues, the FDA was accepting chemical characterization as that rationale, and you were able to limit the amount of animal testing needed, which is great from an animal testing perspective, but also timelines and cost. Right. So now biocompatibility, instead of costing $500,000 or $250,000, it was cut in half, right? Because you were limiting a lot of those long-term systemic animal tests. Local toxicity tests were still really difficult and still are difficult to address using that. But anyways, that is what we were starting to do at NAMSA. And now you have to do it that way. So the FDA has updated ISO 10993 Part 1 multiple times at this point, but the most recent one, and I'm rusty on this because I haven't really spent too much time in it since about 2018, has updated it. You have to use this risk-based approach before you do biocompatibility. It's no longer go check all these boxes. It's, okay, here's all the information I know about my device, the manufacturing process right now, the chemical characterization data. I've addressed these toxicological endpoints. Now I need to go address these through some type of animal testing.
Yeah, that's really cool. I'm all about that. And that's what attracts me to my work as well, is not needing to wait years and sacrifice lots of animals to be able to do something like this and have these kind of biomarkers. You can maybe argue some of the biomarkers aren't one-to-one. Maybe it kind of changes or something like this, but you have a very good idea with this kind of accelerated testing as well. I think it's amazing because, again, like a lot of these devices, pacemakers, brain implants, neural implants, they're meant to be implanted for decades. We don't have time. We don't have decades to test it. We want to do it now. I think that's really cool.
Yeah. And chemical characterization plays a big role in what you're just describing with accelerated aging, right? So instead of doing, you do your initial biocompatibility, you could do the accelerated aging. And then instead of testing that product again, just do chemical characterization and compare the extracts. If the extracts are the same or certain materials went down, why do any more testing? It's done. So it reduced that amount as well on that back end, which I thought was really cool. Yeah, I had come in at a really good time for that because that was really starting to hit its stride. When I had first joined, NAMSA was 100% on the forefront of all that, which was really cool.
That's really cool. Yeah, that sounds like could be another potential consulting section of your company.
Yeah, maybe one day, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Duane, I think this has been really good. I've enjoyed the conversation. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
No, not at all. I think this was great. Everything I mentioned can be found on our website right now. If you were to look at the website tomorrow, which this won't be released tomorrow, I'm sure, it is being revamped currently. The old version was very basic, but we are revamping our website. Everything I talked about, consulting, podcast, events can all be found there. The podcast can be found anywhere, right? Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, wherever you listen to them, but also on our website as well. That's it. And I really appreciate this. I love what you're doing for the space. So I want to say thank you to you as well, because I know the time commitment it takes to put out this kind of content. And it's always good to see when people are doing it for the industry versus for themselves. And you could tell you're doing it for the industry. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah. I don't really consider it work. So that maybe that's why I've kept it up for so long.
Right.
But yeah, thanks so much. This has been great.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.